Does sacking football managers actually work? I've gone back and looked at every single sacking in Premier League history to find out whether that's the case, whether some clubs are better at it than others, whether it's becoming more prevalent, and whether it helps a club avoid relegation. This is our starting point. Does the act of sacking a Premier League manager negatively or positively impact a team's league position come the end of the season? Now, I'm being very exact when I say sacking. Retiring, resigning, leaving by mutual consent, or ending a caretaker spell will not count as a sacking. The sacking must also take place during the course of the season. So any sackings that take place before the start of the season or after the conclusion of the season will not count. This took a really long time for me to research and come up with, so please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing if you're new. Now, with what I mean by sacking explained, let's get into my findings. In total, there have been 122 sackings from the 92-93 season to the 21-22 season. This chart tracks sackings per season, and the general trend is that the practice of sacking managers is becoming more and more common. In the first season of the Premier League, there was only one managerial sacking. Now compare that to the most recent season of the Premier League when there were 9 sackings. In fact, 2004 was the last season where we didn't see at least 3 sackings across the whole season. Teams' owners are getting less and less lenient as Premier League success and survival becomes more and more lucrative. Now let's take a look at the breakdown of clubs who have sacked a manager in the Premier League era. 38 different clubs in total. Unsurprisingly, Chelsea and Sunderland are some of the worst in terms of keeping faith with their managers, but actually it's Spurs who top the sacking charts with 9. If we then introduce league position increase and decrease from the point of a sacking, we can gauge which clubs are the best and worst in terms of getting a positive net result out of a sacking. Essentially, the green bars illustrate whether a sacking improved the team's league position, whilst red represents a negative change in league position. Spurs' 9 sackings have produced a net result of positive 43. That's in terms of league positions, and it's best out of anyone else. Whilst Watford's 5 sackings have produced a league position negative yield of 8. And Crystal Palace top the charts in terms of getting the most out of a sacking. On average, every time they sack a manager, they move up 6.3 places in the league table. But what's the overall picture? Does sacking managers actually work? Well, the short answer is yeah. Just look at how much green there is on this chart compared to the red. And if we accumulate all of the league position differences from before and after every single Premier League sacking, the collective difference is plus 167. And because there have been 122 sackings in our data pool, that means that on average, a sacking increases a club's league position by 1.39 places. Therefore, generally speaking, and purely focusing on the act of sacking in isolation, sacking managers does improve a team's league position come the end of the season. But that doesn't tell the whole story. For example, in the 2018 season, Swansea sacked their manager and they produced a +2 in terms of league position yield. However, they went from 20th to 18th, so even though they got a +2 jump, they were still relegated. In this scenario then, sacking the manager technically worked, but that's hardly relevant if the aim was to avoid relegation, and in most instances, the reason why you'd sack a manager is to avoid relegation. Therefore, we need a more nuanced question. Does the act of sacking a Premier League manager from a club threatened by relegation save that club from relegation? Well, the data on that's much clearer. The act of sacking a manager is ineffective in most cases if the aim is to escape the relegation zone. Of the 122 sackings, 60 were done when the team were in the relegation zone. 24 of those escaped the relegation zone after the sacking, but 36 were relegated anyway. And that means that if you're in the relegation zone and you sack your manager, generally speaking, there's a 60% chance you're going to get relegated anyway. Now, the data does get more favourable if we include teams in and around the relegation zone. Let's call it the danger zone, or DZ for ease of reference. Of those 21 sackings, 4 were still relegated, 7 didn't improve their league position but they still survived, and 10 actually improved their league position. So if you're not actually in the relegation zone at the point of sacking, more like 16th or 17th, then technically there's an 81% chance of survival and only a 19% chance of getting relegated. And now let's combine all of that together. Of the 122 sackings, 81 have been whilst the team is either in the danger zone or the relegation zone. 40 were relegated, 34 were not relegated and actually improved their league position, and then 7 stayed put. And that means that when assessing the sacking of a manager purely in isolation when their team is in the relegation zone or the danger zone, there's a 49.38% chance of relegation, and therefore there's a 50.62% chance of survival, which is very nearly 50-50, and to me suggests that the act of sacking a manager, in terms of the effects, it's quite negligible. Now, of course, there are always going to be other factors at play, such as new signings, external issues, but when solely looking at sackings, it helps generally, but it doesn't make a material difference for clubs trying to avoid relegation. And this also doesn't account for managers who resigned due to poor performances and their team were relegated anyway, nor does it account for teams who stuck with their manager but they were relegated anyway. It's not a perfect model by any means, but I do think it tells us that, generally speaking, if a team is in the relegation zone or thereabouts, it's more to do with the quality of the players rather than the quality of the manager. Some teams just aren't good enough and don't have the player quality to stay in the division, no matter who the manager is. As you might expect, if a manager is sacked whilst their team is higher up the table compared to a team whose manager is sacked lower down the table, the former team does much better than the latter team in most cases because they've got a better starting point. For the most recent danger zone sacking at Bournemouth, they sacked Parker whilst the team were in 17th place. So technically it means this season Bournemouth have an 81% chance of survival. That's purely based on the data we've looked at, but the fact of the matter is Parker's sacking was more to do with his comments rather than his performances as a manager, and that's a context that this data can't account for. Really hope you enjoyed this video. Shout out to my high supporting members on Patreon, Frozone, Owen, Kante. If you made it this far, I assume you like the video, so do consider supporting the channel on Patreon if you want to get some extra perks such as exclusive and early content. The link is just in the description of this video. You can even join for as little as £1 a month, and it really does go a long way to allow me to continue making this content for you guys. Really hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll see you next time.